So welcome everyone to DC Thursday. I'm Pete Soderling. I'm the founder of Data Council and the Data Community Fund. And as you know, I'm your guide through the crazy, evolving wild west of the data ecosystem. And we're here today with another awesome guest. He's the founder of a startup, which is one of our favorite personas on the program. And so I want to welcome Tejas Manohar to the program. Tejas has been, well, first of all, he's the co-founder of a new company called Hightouch. And formerly, he was a tech lead and engineering manager at Segment. And before that, a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley. So Tejas, welcome.
Hey, Pete, it's great to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I want to also remind the audience that if they have any questions for Tejas during our conversation, that they can jump in the YouTube chat and we'll work them into the conversation to the best of our ability. So Tejas, I want to start with your background because you have a sort of a non-traditional background, which always jumps out at me, maybe because I self-identify. But I'm curious to hear about sort of the early days and how you got into tech. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so I actually got into programming just back in like school. So I was programming first to actually make like games and websites and cool things like that I used every day, and I wanted to learn how to do myself. And it wasn't anything really related to data engineering at the time, for sure. It was more like hobbyist programming. When I got into high school, I actually got an internship at a very small local startup that I read about in a newspaper. It was like 3-4 people. They had gone through the 500 startups program in SF and come back to Nashville, where I grew up and where I'm visiting back right now. And then when I actually interned there, this is back in, I think, 2014, they were using a product called Segment, basically to manage their analytics stack. And they were an early customer of this service. I think Segment was maybe a year old at max right now. It was really just hitting its stride as a company, team of less than 10 or maybe even 5 people at the time. And we were one of the early users, and basically use Segment to push our analytics metrics into a few different services, Google Analytics, Mixpanel, and I don't remember what the other one was, but we kind of pushed them all into these services via one universal client on the front end. And it was pretty incredible to see how great the product was. And I started following the company after that for the next couple of years. And eventually I saw how fast this company was growing and what a large pain point it solved, that I decided to just reach out and try to join myself roughly 2 years later, when the team was about 30 people and maybe 8 engineers. So that's really how I broke into tech. I worked a couple small jobs in between at different startups, instrumented Segment over and over, and just realized that was the company I wanted to work at instead, and that the product vision behind kind of centralizing customer data was much more exciting than the consumer apps I was working on.
Got it. Well, I want to dig into your experience at Segment, but before we do that, when did the visiting scholar at UC Berkeley come along, and how did that happen?
Yeah, so since I actually joined Segment directly after high school, I kind of deferred my college admission a few times. The company was growing, and I wanted to know whether I should actually go to college. Decided not to. I want to fast forward the story here. But one of the things I wanted to do when making that decision process is see what it's like to work in a research lab, because that's something that always fascinated me in concept. Something I just didn't know about. And I thought, it'd be cool to try my hand at this and see if that's something I'm interested in more than the startup thing, just like how working at Segment was more interesting than working on consumer stuff for me. So I reached out to some labs that had interesting projects and ended up joining one of them as like a visiting researcher. It was a pretty great experience. Actually, the project I worked on in the lab, it wasn't as exciting as Segment was to me and the growth trajectory of the company, but they did spin out into a separate startup from the lab, which is pretty exciting. Actually, a number of companies have spun up into startups from these couple labs in Berkeley, like Databricks, Mesosphere, like a lot of companies have spun out. And now it all comes around full circle, because one of the co-founders of that startup actually works at Hightouch now, since that startup didn't really hit its stride, which is super exciting. He's basically one of our lead backend engineers today.
Interesting. And how did you make the connections with that lab at Berkeley in the first place? I'm curious.
Yeah, so I think one thing I've gotten really good at over the years in terms of just getting opportunities that I probably am not qualified for, whether it's selling our product when we were in the early days, or just getting a job at Segment, for example, or getting internships at companies like HubSpot in high school. Just getting really good at cold emailing, I think. I think my biggest talent is probably just like being an SDR, maybe, rather than even an engineer, honestly. I think I I ended up emailing a ton of professors, like sending really personalized messages, just like, I guess, sending something detailed enough to try to get in. I think what's interesting about emailing people who are actually have pretty well standing, like, have Wikipedia pages and are on the board of Databricks and stuff like that, is I don't think they actually get that many emails from people in industry asking if they want to volunteer at their lab at Berkeley. So I think when people do get an email, it's exciting enough in that regard, and isn't just templated. Like, they actually respond pretty well to it, and I think that's something I've just like learned over the years. That's how I got all my jobs, all my internships back in school. A lot of our early customers, to be honest, and just like kind of hustling network and cold outreach on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I like that, being the SDR for yourself. I think that's something that many engineers don't think of, and I can definitely understand and identify with that, because that was that sort of process in motion was super helpful to me in my early career as well.
Yeah, the impact that cold emails and just outreach like that has had on my career trajectory or personal trajectory even has just been massive. Like, I met so many people via cold outreach, and it's not the main way we acquire customers as a business today. We do have a small SDR function. It's not the main way we acquire customers today, but it has been pretty impactful for scoring some early customers, contacts in the industry, learning from other companies. Just, it turns out that with a well-written email, a lot of people are willing to talk to you, just given how much spam people get on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, that's a great insight. So cool. So you ended up at Segment. You were one of the earlier engineers there. You said the company was about 30 people or 30 engineers, did you say at the time?
Yeah, it was about 30 to 40 people, and I think I was around the eighth to 10th engineer at the company.
I see.
It was an awesome environment. We had so much scope of work for the team that we had, honestly. It was truly incredible, and we were all working out of a pretty small office in SF, which was a lot of fun. I remember when I interviewed at the company, I was like, wow, there's like 30 people in here. This office it's massive. And then 2 years later, it wasn't really the case. We had grown to like 150 in that office, and it was totally crammed and no longer massive. But yeah, it was an exciting journey at the company. When I joined, I think just with a team of like 8 engineers, we had at least 3 products going on. I think 100 to 200 integrations, just absolute craziness. And it's amazing what you can do in such tight resources.
Yeah, for sure. That the company was a rocket ship, and I'm curious to know, like, what was the state of the data platform at the time that you joined?
Yeah. So I can't remember the exact stats about how much data we were processing, but we definitely had some numbers and billions or tens of billions of being like super happy about processing this amount of data per month. I think it was impressive for our time and scale, but that number grew extremely rapidly since then. And the state of the data platform, originally Segment was written in Node. They switched some of the infrastructure over to Go since, and that was plus and minus 1 year. That transition was incremental, kind of plus and minus 1 year from the time I joined. A lot of the core infrastructure was moved over, and we were using NSQ throughout. So kind of each part of Segment would be connected through basically a series of queues. So the front door API would write all analytics events that are coming into the platform into one queue. That we'd forward that to another series of queues for different destinations and archiving services and the data warehouse pipeline. It should be kind of like queue after queue in a series of microservices. In retrospect, it was a pretty complex infrastructure to manage, especially for a team of 8 to 10 people. And I would say it ended up getting more complicated over time. There are definitely a number of learnings there, but it did work and was able to run at pretty large scale for the team we had.
And what products, you mentioned that you had a few different products. What products were you involved in when you joined?
Yeah. So when I joined, this is actually an interesting story. So when I joined, the first project that I worked on at Segment was building a competitor to what Fivetran is today. So essentially at Segment, for anyone who doesn't know, we had our core product, which allowed companies to collect events, like collect information about their users and what events they're doing in their applications on web, mobile, backend, store, checkout, etc. And when you send these events to Segment, what it would do is it would forward them to a variety of different services, initially just analytics platforms, later marketing platforms, support platforms, etc., that would benefit from having access to that customer data without you having to integrate each and every one. And that was really exciting to me because it was something I used in the past company. But as kind of Segment expanded and got more and more customers and the data space started evolving, our customers started asking us to do more and more things around customer data and just kind of become an all-in-one bundled solution while there were no de facto best of breed players in the space at the time. So one of the things that customers asked for is not just sending data to analytics and marketing services, but also data warehouses like Redshift when Redshift started to take off. So Segment was one of the first companies to integrate with Redshift in a really easy self-service capacity. They called it Segment Redshift at the time. Now it's called Warehouses product. But it allowed you to send all the data you're sending to Segment just to Redshift in like one click. Don't have to do any sort of coding, and that was just crazy at the time. One thing that customers started asking us when we had more and more companies using Redshift is, how do I get the rest of the data for my company in Redshift? How do I get my data from Salesforce, from Zendesk, from MailChimp, Marketo, from all these tools into my Redshift database? Not just my analytics events from the website that I'm collecting in Segment. And at the time, we looked at the market and we basically saw, okay, there are a number of startups working on this as Redshift in particular starts to explode. This was before Snowflake and BigQuery, et cetera, had really hit their stride in terms of mid-market. And there was Fivetran, there was Illuma, Stitch Data. I think they had a little backstory with RJ Metrics, just a number, Xplenty, just a number of companies doing this exact thing on the Redshift wave. But we looked at it and we're like, they all look basically the same. They're all building connectors super fast, and it feels like this space is going to stride towards commoditization. We had Segment of way more customers than all of them. It's combined probably. So let's build a platform to ingest data from various data sources into the warehouse ourselves. And it turned out that we did do that. That was my first project at Segment, basically building a competitor to Fivetran and those services when there was no de facto winner. And we did get pretty high adoption within our own customer base, but as a startup, it's just hard to do multiple things at once. And I think that's a lesson we learned pretty well at Segment. I wouldn't say it was a bad decision in retrospect. It helped people see a broader vision at Segment, justify paying Segment more, et cetera. And tons of companies using Segment still use the Cloud Sources product today. But we never really gave it the same investment and like founder level commitment and incentives and stuff like that, that say a company like Fivetran or an independent company executing on this problem did. And in retrospect, those companies grew way, way faster and just really focused on being a best of breed solution for that rather than doing everything at once. And I think that's an interesting learning in respect. It's definitely still a positive thing for Segment that they did this, but it's not the outcome that we expected for the industry. We expected this to be commoditized. It turns out few companies really pushed through, built those 100+ connectors, maintained them really well, did the community side really well, and just hammered through it for like, what, eight years at this point.
Got it. But at the same time, that sort of expanded your vision, towards the data warehouse. And so I think some good things happened out of that. Talk to me about some of the other insights that you developed over that time.
Totally. So at my time at Segment, not just did I work on the Cloud Sources product, but afterwards I worked on the core warehouse pipelines, and eventually I started working on this product called Personas, which is what Segment is trying to shape their whole vision to be today. And I'm not an insider, but at this point, probably has a bulk of their revenue from on the enterprise side too. So Personas basically said this one thing, which was companies want a central database of customer information that marketing can have like a nice UI to go in and activate this data. So they want marketing to be able to go in to this user database inside a Segment and take subsets of users, transform them, build new traits on them, make cohorts of them and sync those over to different downstream tools and ad platforms, email platforms, etc. So this was the goal of the Personas product. Now it's an entire industry and ecosystem around customer data platforms. But when working on this, I realized a couple key things and key insights that led me to actually found Hightouch. So one thing I realized is that our goal with personas was really to centralize all customer data, all data about a customer into one platform and segment, be the source of truth, and give marketers an interface to activate it. The first thing I realized was that most companies, even those that use segment, didn't have all their data represented in segment. So companies would instrument, analytics events and things like that. But when you start, and that solved a real problem, forwarding those to a variety of services. But when you talk to companies, there were still workflows that segment customers where, CSVs were being passed around between teams or one-off scripts were being written here and there. At segment, we always saw this segment view of the world where someone would file a support ticket asking, how do you do it this way? Or how do you do it that way? And how do you segment to do this? But they never really told us what they were not using segment for. At least as an engineer, I didn't have to review into that, which is a really interesting phenomenon you get into when you have a company that is super useful, but you don't realize you're not solving the full problem because they're actually using a bunch of other services for other things, and they just see the problem in that way. So that was really interesting. I realized that basically companies didn't have all the data they needed in segment. And then two, what I realized was a lot of companies had that data in data warehouses. So that basically led us to the idea of creating a CDP directly on top of the data warehouse. And through a variety of different learnings, we ended up at what Hightouch is today, which is basically a platform for companies to operationalize the data in their data warehouses. So the idea is that companies have tons of data in their warehouse. It's getting easier than ever to collect it into there via tools like Fivetran and Stitch. And it's getting easier than ever to model that data into the source of truth for your customer information using tools like dbt. But what's lacking is really a way for the teams around the company to use that data and operationalize that data on an everyday basis. So I can make a looker dashboard or a mode report of, how many leads per day have this certain lead score and stuff like that. But if I want to present that information, like which leads to focus on to the sales team, I really need to get that information into Salesforce at scale, or it's just a huge enablement and just human process challenge. Likewise, if I want to run ad campaigns off that data, I need to push it to an ad platform, or email campaigns, an email platform, financial reporting, a financial reporting platform like NetSuite or Salesforce or whatever it is. So that's what we do at Hightouch. We basically say the source of truth for customer data is no longer going to be a proprietary SaaS. Instead, it's going to be your own data warehouse, which you have full control of the data models in. And Hightouch will help you take those data models and synchronize them with the systems of action around your company, whether that's like a sales CRM like Salesforce, marketing CRM like Braze or Iterable or SendGrid, or an ad platform or Slack notifications or whatever it is.
And this is the notion that you call reverse ETL, if I'm not mistaken.
Totally. There's definitely a few terms floating around the space for it. Reverse ETL is basically our engineering term for it, or a data term for it. And it's the reason why we choose it, honestly, it's not because it's a flashy term. It's because it's so intuitive. I think that the term almost chose us. In various customer calls, customers would just say, early customers, in fact, and still today, would say, oh, is this basically the reverse of an ETL process? Or is this the reverse of Fivetran? It just naturally fit to say, yeah, this is reverse ETL. ETL takes data and puts it into the warehouse. Reverse ETL takes that data from the warehouse and moves it back into the systems of records, which you typically see as data sources. So yeah, that's the idea behind it. As we start selling Hightouch to more and more business users and business leaders and things like that, we have to pick other terms that are, more approachable by, let's say, a marketing leader or a sales leader. But as we're selling it to data teams, which is our focus today, reverse ETL is just such an intuitive term and really just fits nicely into a modern data stack.
Yeah, I get it. That makes perfect sense. Well, before we talk more about the Hightouch product, I just kind of wanted to dig in with you a little bit on what it's like to start a company as an engineer, because I know there's lots of engineers in our audience that watch the show and that come to our events and conferences. And I meet them often, and having started 4 companies myself as an engineer, I try to help them however I can. But it's always great to hear from other folks in the community, like what were the challenges starting a company as an engineer? What was scary? Like, did you ever sort of think about not doing it? I'm just interested in the psychology around, you making the decision to leave a good job at Segment and ultimately start your own thing? Like what did you have to get through and work through to get there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I might be in a different case, but I think I kind of always wanted to start a company. Seeing entrepreneurs on TV, seeing how widespread technology could get in just terms of adoption. And I always just had kind of an ambition to start a company. This probably dates back to like, honestly, middle school. At this point, I knew I wanted to do other things. I knew there was a lot of things I wanted to do in life. Even being a doctor was probably one of them at the time, but starting a company and just starting like a large business that lots of people interact with and created something from ground up was just always exciting to me. What it was in, I didn't know at the time, but that was always an exciting idea to me. Making the jump was still extremely difficult. I'd had a lot of different side projects growing up, and some did okay, some a lot didn't. A lot didn't even get off the ground. So making the jump to actually leave my full-time job was difficult until it basically got to the point where, honestly, my full-time job wasn't that exciting. In complete transparency, I think the first couple years and few years at Segment, I have no regrets about my time at Segment. It was a great learning experience. I thought you wouldn't be around if not for staying at Segment for so long, to be completely honest. But after working at the company for a few years, it just reached a scale which wasn't as exciting for me. I mean, there were like, 400, 500, 600 people at the company. It's pretty clear that we would have an exit at some point. Revenue was nearing like 100 million, which is over. Now it's much more than that, but at the time it was much over 10x when I joined. And it was just, I'd already seen the growth trajectory that I wanted at the company, and I no longer felt that being at the company was the most unique opportunity for me career-wise. So I had a couple options. I could either start something, a couple ideas floating around, or join one of my friends that was working on something. And this is where the story gets interesting. So initially, when I left Segment, I lived with a handful of people, still do, and two of them were starting their own companies at the time. They'd already been working on them on the side for a while. One was my coworker from Segment, Josh, who I became friends with at Segment, and actually originally hired onto the Personas team where we worked on this product together. And he was starting a company in the IoT space. And then the other one was Kashish, who was actually working on a travel company initially, and working on it for a while before I joined, and had just gotten into YC actually, and decided to, at the time I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I think I didn't want to do developer tools again or something like that. So I decided to work with Kashish work with Kashish on the travel company. And a year later, we ran into this thing called COVID. The travel company was severely affected by that, and we started kind of thinking about other ideas we'd been noodling on, Hightouch being one of them. At the same time, Josh, who was living with us and working in the same room with us the whole year, was facing some product market fit problems with his company and decided to pivot as well. And we decided to just all team up. So it's a pretty interesting story in retrospect. It basically ended up working with both of the people that I was considering working with at the time, and on a new idea, which I was kind of considering at the time instead of the ideas that they were working on. All due to COVID in retrospect. And I honestly think most important thing when joining a company, the thing that really hit it for me was not the idea or anything like that. It was just the people I would get to work with. So just having a good founding team, a good group of co-founders. That was the biggest thing for me that helped me get over the edge of making the jump as an engineer. I think doing it alone, it would have been difficult in retrospect, but with a good group of co-founders, it's just much easier to justify it because it's just way more fun and way less scary.
Yeah, it's so true. Is finding the right co-founders is maybe half, maybe more of the battle. Sometimes it seems. Well, that's a great story. I'm really glad that you guys were able to band together and come out of COVID with such a cool product. And some of that is luck and being in the right place at the right time. And I'm sure some of that is just your own individual passions and experience at certain things before that maybe hadn't worked out so well, which is often, the case, the backstory with a lot of companies that are successful, but weren't in a previous incarnation or a previous startup that the founder had launched. So yeah, that's very real world experience, and appreciate you sharing that. So sort of coming back to Hightouch, I wanted to, so you've pioneered this new category of reverse ETL. It's not just how the data gets into the warehouse, but you're starting to talk about how the data gets out of the warehouse, which essentially extends the ETL pipeline sort of to the right side of the data warehouse. Like when you're, because this is somewhat of a new concept, and you're trying to sell it and explain it to customers, like who do you typically find your customers are? Like whose eyes light up when you talk about this technology? Who has this need, and sort of how have you identified what the customer profile is?
Yeah, totally. So I think this is a really interesting one for our company in particular, because pretty much every company struggles with the problem of data integration. And that makes it easy in some ways, but also really hard in other ways to decipher who your ideal customer should be. One would intuitively think, oh, every company has customer data problems. Every company should be a customer of Hightouch. And I think that is the case in the long term. But in the short term, if we just took that approach, and some of this is deliberate. Again, a lot of this is actually luck and just right place, right time sort of thing. But if we just took this widespread approach to finding customers, Hightouch wouldn't be at the state that it is today. What was really, really impactful for us was finding the right initial customers that would have a high hit rate of sorts, the right communities and circles where our ideal early adopters live, to really take off and get a ton of organic growth early on in our company's life cycle, which has been tremendous for us from a business perspective. Otherwise, we probably have to do the SDR that I mentioned earlier and just be emailing people to use our software. But essentially what we found was this group of users in the DBT community. So for anyone who doesn't know, DBT, probably everyone knows at this point, but DBT is basically an open source tool with also a SaaS offering that allows you to easily model data in your warehouse using just SQL. So before, to do data modeling in your warehouse and transform raw tables into normalized ones and kind of build a whole DAG of these transformations, you would have to be a data engineer and use tools like Python and Airflow and all these sort of platforms engineering platforms to do data modeling. DBT realized that the hard part about data modeling is the modeling itself. SQL is a super expressive language to do this. And let's make a framework that's dead simple so that an analyst can basically become a data engineer. Anyone who knows SQL can operate like a data engineer. And that really reduced the barrier to entry for data modeling at companies that previously didn't have the capacity to hire a big data engineering team or do all this sort of work, so that the SQL that you could write to get answers at a company could be much more accessible because you're working on a cleaned up, well-modeled data set. So what we found was that users who had adopted DBT and started modeling data left and right in the company had started creating a new source of truth for data in their warehouse. So the problem of getting data into tools like Salesforce, et cetera, is a global problem. But in terms of how we solve it by moving data out of the warehouse, we really had to look for customers that were ready to use our solution on the get-go when they heard about it and didn't need a lot of convincing. And those were users of DBT and tools like DBT that basically help you model data in the warehouse super easily. Because when you're building these new data models in the warehouse, like what's the user's ARR trajectory, what's the user's LTV, what's their churn risk, what's their actual name, are all their profiles from all these different tables combined. You're building those source of truth in the warehouse via DBT. You don't have that source of truth anywhere else. The warehouse itself kind of becomes a silo almost in that regard within an organization, and can only be approached by people who know SQL or BI tools or anything like that. And by having the source of truth, the unique source of truth in your data warehouse, it basically creates the need for Hightouch as a solution, which is a really easy way to bring that source of truth from the warehouse into the rest of the tools, versus companies who just have raw data from a variety of systems in the warehouse. They might even prefer a point-to-point approach where they're connecting Salesforce directly to a NetSuite or using some totally non-warehouse-based architecture for this, like a MuleSoft or something like that. So I think for us, in the long term, we believe that Hightouch is the solution that's going to prevail, and we have to really make our product more and more accessible to companies, help them through that data maturity curve, et cetera. But in the short term, what really helped us get our stride as a company was finding that ideal customer profile that just got it instantly, could post about how excited they are about this product, and just tons of people like them would see it. And for us, that was the DBT user community.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And it reminds me of this insight that someone shared with me once regarding how to question your early users about in sort of a structured way so that you get a clear picture of not just how they're using your product, because that's pretty obvious to you based on product analytics. The more interesting and often more important questions for an early user were, what were you doing immediately before you reached for Hightouch? Like what was the thing that you were doing, for instance, with your data, transforming it with DBT in your warehouse, trying to solve some particular kind of problem, and then all of a sudden, importing that data back into a customer or a line of business tool using a tool like Hightouch becomes totally obvious. But it's a step before that can sometimes unlock insights into what a larger group of customers, at scale would want to do, and what they're doing before they immediately sort of reach for your tool. So
Completely.
I've always found that a helpful insight.
Completely. And I think at first we were like, the Slack community doesn't have that many users. Like, how many companies would have this problem? Like, are we slicing the world of our potential customers too much? And
Mm-hmm.
really, in reality, you need to find something where you can get a really high hit rate of your customers. If you're reaching out to 1,000 companies and just a few of them need your product, that's just not a strategy that's just going to work for an early stage startup, at least selling the contract sizes that we are, where it's like accessible and self-service and not some massive enterprise thing where we're selling $10 million contract to Walmart. But in
Mm-hmm.
our stage, you really need to find that high hit rate. You need to find where your users that just immediately get it live. Obviously, there's some messaging problems and stuff like that there. But once you find that, that's what really unlocked a really big trajectory for our company. And since then, we've been lucky in a lot of regards, but the DBT Slack user group has grown like crazy. The adoption of the software has just grown massively outside of the community as well. Basically, it's come to the point where I think over half of our prospects are either using DBT, trying DBT, or like about to try DBT, which is pretty
Mm-hmm.
incredible. And we do
Mm-hmm.
have tons of companies that don't use DBT, use alternatives, use in-house solutions, et cetera now, and it's not a prerequisite to using our product in any regards. But it did allow us to get our first end customers for tons of feedback and just a level of virality and word of mouth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And aside from using DBT to transform data in the data warehouse, what do you think customers were doing before Hightouch? They were essentially sort of crafting flat files and importing flat files back into Salesforce, or like how was the world like? I'm sure there was a subset of customers or people that were sort of trying to do what Hightouch offers in terms of importing stuff back. Like, what do you think those systems look like, and what were some of the pains of the world, in that batch?
Totally, yeah. It basically narrows down to CSVs and scripts. There's or doing nothing, CSVs and scripts. So there's tons of companies that do nothing. They don't have customer data, good customer data in their end systems. Their sales teams can't see what's going on in the product. And their marketing teams can't personalize the email communication that they send you. And that's why, honestly, a lot of sales suck. It's like, did this guy even check what I'm doing, the product I've already been using? I'm already happy. I just want to pay. And that's why a lot of marketing sucks as well. You just
Mm-hmm.
don't know who you are as a user. So doing nothing is the biggest category. I think for companies that are doing well and growing quickly, CSVs and scripts are what we see happening. And CSVs meaning exporting data from BI tools and stuff like that and importing it, or doing some Excel magic before you import it, and then just doing that on a manual basis, which obviously has tons of limitations in terms of how quickly you can get that data to end tools, how reliable it is, what happens when that person who does that leaves, a lot of different scenarios there. And then when companies hit all those problems, the other solution was oftentimes scripts. I think companies who are already thinking about the problem, companies were already thinking about the problem in the same way we are by the time we launched Hightouch, which is pretty awesome. At first, we were like, is that worrisome? Like, companies are able to create scripts to do this. And some of the companies would be like, oh, my scripts are fine when we talk to them. 6 months later, a lot of those companies became customers of Hightouch because they needed a new integration, a new use case, an engineer left, it hit an error, a variety of things. And it turns out people just want to pay a SaaS solution to not have to think about this at all. So I think if you see workflows that are happening in complex manual Excel type things, CSV uploads, or you see companies writing scripts to solve problems, that means it's a pretty big problem at the company. And ignore the people who seem to have it under control. and just focus on the ones that don't, because the chances are there's plenty of companies that don't, and the ones that do have it under control won't have it under control in due time. So yeah, those are what we see ourselves replacing pretty often at companies that are thinking about the problem the same way as us. For example, like one of our customers at Lucidchart told us, like a marketing ops person from Lucidchart actually told us that after the data team implemented Hightouch, she no longer has to wake up every Saturday and Sunday morning to upload a CSV into Marketo and add problems, which is actually incredible that they have to do that to power automation prior to this. And many of our customers have been like, oh, I don't even have to think about scripts anymore. So a lot of similarities there. I would say one other thing we're seeing is there are a class of companies who weren't thinking about the problem the way we were initially, but now due to Hightouch and due to our marketing and stuff like that, they're starting to think about the problem differently. So now we're not just collecting, DBT community users that were building script or was just searching for the solution, but we're also getting users who come from seeing spaces like iPaaS, where you point Salesforce APIs and NetSuite APIs and at Marketo APIs and do integration and kind of like a visual UI that's basically programming, becomes a giant Ruth Goldberg machine of data integration. It's like basically an enterprise version of Zapier. We're getting a lot of customers from these sort of services. We're also getting a lot of customers who were previously trying to assemble a source of truth in a CDP and saying, the data warehouse is actually where all my data lives. Let's build a CDP right on top.
Yep, got it. And what sort of size of team would you say is reaches for a solution like Hightouch? Is there a particular profile or size of data team that ends up like looking for a tool like this, or do you have very small companies, or very very small? Like, what's the smallest team you have? I'm curious, using the solution.
Yeah, we do have the company here. Okay, so our kind of sweet spot is companies that have a data warehouse, companies that have good data in the warehouse, so they have data from Fivetran and things like that. And then if they use DBT, it's like you need Hightouch for sure. If they don't use DBT, so they still might need Hightouch. A lot of our early customers didn't use DBT, and still a lot of them do not yet, and are soon to adopt it or something of that nature. But having a data warehouse and having good data in it is actually generally a prerequisite. We're seeing that happening earlier and earlier in companies, which is super exciting for our business. I think when we closed Retool as a customer, I feel like they were just 20, 25 people, kind of no code tool to build internal dashboards, which is pretty early stage for having a data warehouse and all these kinds of shenanigans. Close similar companies like Zeppelin, Mixmax, just really like startups do use our product pretty successfully now, which is exciting from perspective of just everyday random companies are signing up and just getting value out of the product without talking to like anyone in that nature. But luckily and what we knew from the beginning is this thing scales up all the way to the enterprise, where basically the data warehouse is the only solution to this problem, because your data is just so complex that you can't go build a source of truth in another system. And there's just so much history behind it. So now we're working with publicly traded companies like Auto Trader, breakout companies like unicorn companies, like Lucidchart and Plaid and Mattermost, and a variety of those companies as well. And it's a pretty wide range. I think we even do have some companies less than 10 people who just have specific needs that made them create a data warehouse, just plug Hightouch right up to a production database and start creating Slack feeds and CRM notifications and automating different things around their company off their source of truth customer data.
Got it. And are there any particular use cases that Hightouch isn't suited for in this category? Like, how do you think about what the tool isn't good at?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one thing that's a limitation of Hightouch right now, and I think this is being overcome slowly, luckily, is what we're seeing from the customer side, is basically the ingestion latency and just the whole latency of a data warehouse-based pipeline. Data warehouses are getting faster. Batch operations are getting a lot faster too. But by default, like at most companies, we can assume that these operations are happening on an hourly basis or every day kind of basis or something like that, which limits Hightouch from being used for certain use cases when plugged up to a data warehouse. A majority of use cases, from what we're finding, can be solved in a batch pipeline. And companies are all making their data warehouses faster, but there are certain specialized use cases that truly need to happen in real time. Like, for example, if I check out an item in a store at Starbucks and I want to send a notification immediately after that happens with my receipt, really can't do that via the data warehouse, the mainstream data warehouse today. What's interesting here as a trend is like, I think just as a tangent trend here is that I think a lot of companies have prioritized easier and more accessible and more reliable data infrastructure over quote unquote more powerful or better data infrastructure. So if we look 10 years ago, all the hype was real-time systems. Things like Apache Flink were coming out and Spark streaming and like all these new products to do things in real time. And then batch infrastructure actually just got way better and way easier to use, way easier to adopt, way more reliable and more scalable. Cloud services like Snowflake came out, and batch infrastructure got so good that people forego their requirement that they had of real time earlier, because it just created so many different headaches for a company from an operational perspective that led to ineffectiveness in doing things throughout the organization at scale. And in that case, people really sacrifice some power for reliability, ease of use, and productiveness, which I think is a really interesting trend. Now we're seeing, now that global default way to store all your customer data and query it, like Snowflake and other cloud data warehouses, is mainstream. We're seeing those companies start to invest more in making streaming capabilities and real-time capabilities in the warehouse itself. So we know Snowflake has a team on this, Google has a team on this, and they publicly write about this. And there's also a variety of startups tackling this problem from a different angle, like for example, Materialize. We're really excited about all the competition in this space and how it's going to drive forward the warehouses in general. But right now we see that as one of the limitations of kind of the underlying platform that we sit on top of, which affects some of the use cases for our software. The other thing is, if you don't have a data warehouse, Hightouch is generally not a good fit. There are great use cases for point-to-point services. We use Zapier at Hightouch. We connect our Calendly to our Slack via Zapier. I don't need my Calendly data inside of my data warehouse to send a Slack notification to me every time a meeting is booked. I just don't really need that. It doesn't provide value to me or our data team or anything like that at Hightouch. And we're really happy to use Zapier for these sorts of use cases. And there's so many more use cases that make sense. In fact, sometimes we trigger Zapiers in Hightouch. I think it's a different problem set. What we know is that integrating core business data with a variety of systems and kind of building a single view of the customer is a specialized problem that isn't to be solved in like a point-to-point WYSIWYG way. And it's to be solved properly on top of a foundation like a data warehouse. But I think sometimes people have this unilateral view of the world where, oh, Hightouch just needs a solution to this. It's the only way to do things in my company. That's just not really true. It's one of solutions in a wider problem. And we think it'll tackle a majority of use cases, especially going in the long term, but not necessarily all.
Got it. Well, you mentioned, some of the underlying architecture around the current way of ingesting stuff into data warehouses, which makes perfect sense. I wanted to ask you, switch gears a little bit and talk to you a little bit about the design principles and sort of the architectural paradigms that you followed when building Hightouch, because I know there were some things you reflected in the way that you had built some things at Segment that you did differently in Hightouch. So I wanted to ask you about that and see if you could share a little bit more detail.
Totally. I think there's a few things here that are interesting. So one thing is that we don't heavily use queues for data processing throughout our infrastructure. And we process a lot of data in batch. So by processing a lot of data in batch, we don't need these individual messages floating around and all these queues that we're consuming. And we actually have more of the database as a queue within Hightouch, which has a number of different advantages. There's definitely trade-offs to both. There's not one globally right answer, but I think it's super easy to administer is one of the advantages. So by using Postgres database as a queue, our small team of engineers and DevOps people can actually administer it at ease. A lot of queues that are easy to administer, like NSQ, for example, which we later moved out of to Kafka at Segment, have a lot of issues when running production systems where you can't lose data. I mean, it's very easy to lose data in the system because the data actually just gets deleted once you acknowledge the message and process it by the consumer that you're writing. It's processing data from the queue. Whereas queues like Kafka actually just have a layer of persistence, and the data is persisted for a separate setting of how long you say it should be persist for, how much data you want to persist. And instead, you're reading batches of messages basically out of a persistent queue. It's a very different architecture. But at the same time, those services are actually super hard to administer and integrate with. And at Segment, we had a whole team dedicated to that. So I think using a database as a queue and just kind of as a queue of work to be done, to be read out and have batches of messages that we can read out of systems like S3 has been like a hack for us to get by pretty far. And I think might end up being our architecture forever, honestly, without having to have a huge team like administering this stuff and a bunch of complexities. The other thing, which I think is actually more interesting, is what we call our hybrid architecture at Segment. Sorry, at Hightouch, not Segment. So the way most products in this kind of ecosystem work is data goes through a system and it gets stored in its database and all this sort of stuff to build a single view of the customer before syncing it out to other systems. That's how Segment works. That's how a lot of systems work around the ecosystem. At Hightouch, we have this architecture where basically you can sign up self-service online and then we use our own infrastructure, but you can actually keep using Hightouch as a SaaS service, but keep all the data and state and storage of data inside of your own infrastructure, which is a pretty interesting architecture that helps us work with like healthcare companies, with HIPAA compliance, fintech companies that are just super stringent, companies in Europe that need data to be persisted inside of their own region, et cetera, at ease. And how it works is basically you can go into the Hightouch settings and actually provide us an S3 bucket or a GCS bucket or an Azure bucket, an AWS S3 bucket, et cetera. And basically Hightouch will use that instead of our own S3 bucket or our own disk to store all data. So all the data is queued up there. All the state of the last results we sync to something like Salesforce is queued up there. When you look at our live debug it, our app, and start poking through rows that fail or anything like that, or error messages that might contain PII, all of that is stored in your infrastructure. We never save it on our end. And that is pretty instrumental for us to work with like tons of other companies and tons of large companies like Blend or Plaid or 30 Madison without having to go through tons and tons of compliance and process and things like that. Because we just don't store data in our infrastructure. And then I think the other principle that we've had at Hightouch is you can do really complex things in terms of setting up Hightouch with your data infrastructure in our UI completely self-service. You actually can't even do some of these things inside of tools that exist like Fivetran. But one thing we've focused on is just making it really, really easy to get set up, even if you're at a massive company that has a bunch of infrastructure challenges. Like if your data warehouse is in a private network and you need to create an SSH tunnel or a reverse SSH tunnel to connect Hightouch to that data warehouse that's not publicly accessible on the internet, you can do that all through the Hightouch UI, and it'll generate SSH keys, tell you the commands to run on your server, give you a status check for it, and it's all completely self-service. If you want to give Hightouch an S3 bucket that we use for storing all the data that we need to store to run our operations, you can do completely through our settings pages and UIs. And that's pretty powerful because a lot of times people at large companies are like, I want to adopt this software, but I'm gonna have to go through a bunch of hurdles. And because I need these enterprise features, I'm gonna have to talk to someone and then ping my DevOps team and all these things. And of course, those things still happen. I mean, every company is different. There's a lot of layers of complexity in large companies. But because of this focus on making everything self-service, we have fairly large companies that just actually set up Hightouch end-to-end themselves with a pretty complex security policy and infrastructure and stuff like that, just like they might set up things in AWS. Whereas I think if we didn't focus on making all these complex product experiences self-service, people might just default to writing scripts just to not have to go through the levels of bureaucracy that most SaaS vendors require you to do things like a hybrid architecture.
Well, this is a really interesting deployment model. So correct me if I'm wrong, but are you saying that you don't have a VPC, you don't need to have a VPC oriented install for the customers, because even your own SaaS cloud product has the option to sort of store data inside the client's infrastructure, which means that you don't actually have to support a full VPC, which would have been the previous sort of common wisdom in sort of enabling a sensitive or secure installation inside of a client's own private cloud.
Exactly. This basically we're getting, it's not fully on-prem software, right? But we're getting closer and closer to the benefits of on-prem software without actually making you install anything by leveraging the fact that you have everyone has cloud providers that has services that you can plug up to your SaaS, which is actually kind of incredible. I think it's something that we need to advertise a lot more and just maybe talk about from a technology perspective. Like basically all our infrastructure and databases, like DynamoDB and Postgres and like whatever we have on our end, all basically serves pointers to customer data that lives in the customer's own infrastructure in S3 bucket rather than storing the data itself. And that means Hightouch doesn't even have to implement things like retention policies. If you just turn on an expiration policy inside of your Amazon S3 bucket or whatever you provide us, that data is just deleted, and there's no Hightouch part of that can go wrong, which is a truly incredible guarantee that helps us work with tons of companies. Like I think without this, there's no way that we could have worked with companies like Plaid and Blend within the first N years of our operation that actually integrate with like banks and process things like loans. But it's just truly that this architecture is fundamentally a lot more secure and compliant than your typical SaaS that processes a lot of customer data.
Got it. And would you say that this is a competitive advantage between you and some of the other players in the space?
Yeah, totally. The fact that we basically store nothing, like no cache, et cetera, and use an S3 bucket for this approach is a pretty large competitive advantage. Some of our competitors, like Census, for example, I think store the state of what was previously synced back into the customer's data warehouse, like into a Redshift table or Snowflake table or BigQuery table. But then you can't really use those tables to power features like a row by row debugger inside of the UI, because you can't be querying the customer's data warehouse to power those sort of UI features. But what is fast enough to query? An S3 bucket that you have pointers to the specific files you need to open at specific offsets inside of your own database. So our architecture is pretty unique in that manner, where we do power a lot of things off the customer's data infrastructure, but not in a way that it bottlenecks our development, because we just use the right cloud services for the right tasks, which I think is pretty exciting. And I think it's something that's going to become more common as just the whole ecosystem of compliance grows globally. I think this sort of hybrid architecture is going to be something you see more and more of. At Segment, it's something we talked about a lot, and maybe it'll happen at some point too, but just logistically, that's like a year plus project with a number of products they have, that the number of databases they have and queues they have and systems like Kafka they have and stuff like that. It's just crazy to implement a new architecture like this at an existing scale. And I think for certain companies that have a lot of regulation, just like we see on-prem software beating out competitors, we might see like hybrid architecture software beating out competitors in the same way. And not to say we wouldn't do fully on-prem or something like that down the road, but the fact that we've been able to work with so many sensitive companies with this architecture has been tremendous, because on-prem doesn't come without its own downsides. It's very hard to do support and figure out and debug and figure out what's going on in on-prem architecture, where you have thousands or hundreds of companies running Hightouch inside of their own infrastructure. It's a nightmare when people say something is going wrong. You just need higher contract values to justify it and all sorts of things. So it's not to say we wouldn't do it, but definitely not something we want to invest in right now.
Yeah, this hybrid approach is really fascinating, and I tend to agree with you. I think you should talk about this more, and maybe we'll get you to give a data council talk on the topic, because I think that would be really fascinating.
Josh would probably kill to do that.
Great,
CTO,
awesome. Yeah, that would be great.
The hybrid architecture. I think it's a lot of fun too. When pitching engineers to join our company, it's actually a lot of fun to work with, and it's not as painful as on-prem either.
Yeah, that's great. No, that sounds like a real competitive advantage. So very cool. Well, Tejas, it's great to chat. I just wanted to ask you before we let you go, because I know you're a busy guy with lots of things to do. What surprised you most about working in the data ecosystem so far?
Yeah, honestly, I think what surprises me most is how fast things are moving despite how old things are. So a lot of people think, oh, these data warehouses are blowing up and stuff. Data warehouses have been around since, I don't know, the 70s to 80s, like as a concept, and IBM's been playing in the space for a really long time. companies like Informatica are approaching or already 20 years old. Data warehousing is an age-old problem, but the velocity at which the whole data ecosystem started moving in the last 10 years with the rise of mobile, the rise of just analytics services, et cetera, and just the data explosion inside of companies has caused like a huge wave of momentum over the last 5 years, I think, inside of what's happening in the data space. And every week we wake up to new companies and new ideas and new open source projects and all these new things that affect how we think about our product at Hightouch, what we want to pursue, what we want to integrate, where we want to drive the boundaries of our product. And I think the biggest thing that surprised me is, despite how old these things are, how quickly the ecosystem has been moving.
Yeah, isn't that true? It really has been an explosion, especially even in the past few years. And it's great to see Hightouch start to carve out this category on top of and to the right of the data warehouse. I think it's a really interesting space in general in the data ecosystem that needs to fill out. So yeah, kudos to you, and thanks for being on and sharing some of your wisdom and insight.
Yeah, totally. Glad to be here.
And to the rest of our listeners, thanks for joining again. We have another event in 2 weeks where Christian Zianch from Continual will be here, and he'll be talking about machine learning on top of the data warehouse. So it seems to be
Tristan's a friend. So.
A recurring theme. Yeah, Tristan's awesome. And so we're excited to have him on the show. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to get notified when we go online again in the future. Thanks to Tejas again, and thanks to all of you for listening. We'll see you soon.